Hi there, Emily Midget here with you today on the Pinkfresh Studio YouTube channel. And today I have a video sharing some no-line coloring tips and how to bring out kind of an iridescent quality to your watercoloring with adding some kind of unconventional colors to your watercoloring. So I'm starting out, I've got the nesting hexagon foil plate and dies, which we're going to pair with the foil tile cover plate that was just released. We're going to pair that with the Magnolia stamp and die and some Fabriano Artistico watercolor paper. And then we also have some Carin markers. These are watercolor markers. And I like to pair them with the Fabriano Artistico watercolor paper. I find that combination works really well. These Carin markers are a little bit challenging sometimes because they like to sink down into the paper, so they're kind of persnickety, and you have to kind of figure out which paper works best for you. So there I just removed some Fabriano Artistico paper from the watercolor block. It's a 5x7 block, and now I am stamping the Magnolia stamp set that I actually illustrated for Pinkfresh. I'm stamping it with some contour ink from Hero Arts. This is my favorite ink to use for no line coloring for both watercolor and for Copic coloring. And I've just stamped it. It's all one piece. That stamp is all one piece, so it's really easy to stamp that and get really nice coverage. So now here what I'm demonstrating is the Carin markers. It makes a huge difference whether you put the marker directly to the watercolor paper versus picking some of that color up off of a ceramic palette. The color on the left is directly to the paper, marker directly to the paper, and the color on the right is very diluted, and it helps you control the intensity of the color when you use the ceramic palette. I find that I get much better results with the Carin markers when I use that in conjunction with a ceramic palette. So here I've scrabbled some. This is some dark burgundy Carin marker that I have scribbled onto my ceramic palette, and I am picking that up with my damp paintbrush. This is a silver black velvet round number 6 paintbrush, and I am picking up that color. I've diluted it with some water, and I'm picking it up with that damp paintbrush, laying it down on my image and cleaning my brush and pulling some more of that color out with the clean damp paintbrush. Now with no line coloring, one of the most important things that you can one of the most important goals that you can have with no line watercoloring is to keep the edges of your images crisp. Make that contrast between the light and the dark, but keep the edge of your light area, in this case the light petals, keep the edges of those petals light on top, and then the petals behind, you want to add depth and darkness to them. That you want to intensify the color on those petals that are tucked behind the petals on top. So what I'm doing, I'm laying down that darker color on the petals directly behind, that are kind of tucked behind, that are in the back. I'm using the tip of my paintbrush, keeping the tip of my paintbrush pointed away from me, and I am keeping that color directly in that tucked in area, trying to make sure that I keep the edge of the petal on top nice and crisp. So I'm just adding lots of different color, lots of intense shading. I like to add violet shadows. I think that those violet shadows really, they add depth and they add shadow to your color, but they don't add a whole lot of vibrance to it. So I'm diluting that violet color and I'm adding it to the petals that are tucked behind, but I'm making sure to use the tip of my paintbrush to keep the edges of the petals on top nice and crisp. To get the best results with your no-line watercoloring, it's very important to keep your wet sections separated. So when I am working with no-line watercoloring, I work in one section. When I finish with that section, I move to an area that is completely removed from that wet area. I keep the wet areas away from each other, and that way I don't risk the color bleeding into each other and blurring the edges of those nice crisp lines. When you are trying to convey a shape with no line coloring, it's important to keep those edges nice and crisp, and if your colors are blurring into each other, you're not going to have the definition of the edges of each of those petals. So that's a really important step to keep your areas, your wet areas, away from each other. Work in sections. This is why I'm constantly rotating my paper to make sure that I, A, am keeping my tip of my paintbrush pointed away from me to get good control, and B, to make sure that I am keeping my wet areas apart from each other. So there we've added some violet shadows, and that's just keeping the color kind of intensified towards the center. Now we're going to pick up on the iridescence in the foiled piece that I have, the foiled nested hexagon. I've got a coral, kind of an aqua blue color, and then a limey green color, and I'm going to add lots of water to those to make them very diluted and very pastel and very pale. Now, these diluted colors, they're just very pale, very subtle washes of color. That's what we're adding to the edges of our petals. The petals, we've kept the color very concentrated towards the center of the flower, but the edges, they're kind of, they fade nicely into the white. We've left lots of highlights. We've allowed that white watercolor paper to really shine through from behind. Because these watercolors are translucent, you are able to get lots of really great highlights with this bright white Fabriano Artistico paper. And so I am picking up on that and allowing those white highlights. I'm adding just very subtle washes of these three colors in just kind of random spots. We're not trying to change the color, the overall color of the flower. We're just trying to pick up on some of the iridescent highlights of that foil. I've foiled that nesting hexagon piece die cut with Aura Spellbinders foil. It's AURA, and it's a very pretty gold kind of iridescent color, and I've never used it before, and it's so pretty. And I thought that it would be really fun to pick up on that kind of rainbow effect in the foil with the watercoloring. So I'm just adding very light, subtle washes on the edges of the petals, and then I clean my paintbrush and I dip it in the water and clean it and dab it on my stamp chamois, and then kind of pull that color out so that it fades nicely and organically into the color. So there's no harsh lines or anything like that. It all kind of becomes one cohesive piece. I'm still working in sections to keep the wet sections away from each other, but because I'm not working with a ton of water, it's drying relatively quickly. So now we have all of our flowers finished. We're going to work on some of the foliage. So I'm going to use a kind of a bright jungle green color in the Karin markers, and I work it with foliage. I try to think of them as their own separate flower petals. Each section of the foliage, I've divided them into two sections. Each section of each leaf is its own individual petal, and so it has its own curvature and its own shape. And so I try to show that with lots of shadows and lots of shading, and I work in sections again because we are using no line coloring technique. So here I'm just adding, this is the first layer, this is the kind of jungle green color, and then we're going to go back in and we're going to add, I believe it's called olive black. And it just adds a really nice intense level of shadow in that lower area where the leaf would connect to the stem or would be connected behind the flower. So we're going to add, again, I'm scribbling it onto my ceramic palette, picking that color up with my damp paintbrush because I can get better control of that color with my damp paintbrush than I could if I took the marker and put it directly to the paper. So I'm just adding very light touches of that olive black to my foliage, laying it down with my damp paintbrush, and then cleaning my brush and pulling that color out again. So there we have our finished watercolored pieces. Now we're going to die cut this, and you can see in the iridescence of that foiled piece, it really is picked up with the kind of rainbow color scheme that we've got on those petals, just very subtle rainbow effect. I'm going to die cut this with the one piece. I love that this die is one piece, and so you get all of those pieces just from running your die through your machine just one time. So there are all of our individual die cut pieces. Now we're going to work on, this is kind of an inlaid frame. So I'm going to die cut a floral tile cover plate from just some plain white cardstock. This is the same shade of white cardstock that I used with the foiled frame. And I have die cut that with some white cardstock, and I'm going to use the same size of die to die cut the from the top of the foil plate, from the top of the floral tile plate, I'm sorry, excuse me. And now we have an extra piece that I can save for another project, and we're going to create a really intricate but still subtle frame for our foiled frame. So now we've got the area behind that's nice and it's just a crisp white palette for you to, a background for you to have behind your bright flowers. And I'm just going to inlay that and adhere a little bit of washi tape to keep it in place while I add my foam adhesive. So I'm going to add some foam adhesive on back there and add that to my A2 card base. And then I'm going to arrange my Magnolia, watercolored Magnolia die cuts. And I'll just use some washi tape to keep those in place while I add my foam tape behind. I've really been loving adding a double layer of foam tape to my projects, adding lots of height to my projects. So that on the card base itself, I've got a double layer of foam tape, and the rest of it, since the base layer is already popped up, I'm just using one layer of foam tape. Now this is a brushed sentiments that I have heat embossed in white on some vellum and die cut with the coordinating dies. And I'm adding that with some foam tape as well as some liquid adhesive, keeping those flowers with the double layer of foam tape, helping them have some extra height and keeping them in the forefront. And now we're just adding some iridescent white jewels to help pick up on that iridescent theme that we've got going here. And then we're finished. Super white and bright and crisp, but I love the kind of just the subtle rainbow effect that you get adding those little touches of coral and lime and aqua to the edges of the flower petals. So I hope you guys enjoyed that video. I hope you learned something. I hope you'll try out adding some little iridescent touches to your own watercolored flowers. If you liked the video, please hit the subscribe button, and thanks so much for watching. Have a great day. Bye.